Cartier bracelet catches the light as Brielle Hayes reaches for her phone. She's at Cipriani, celebrating with three friends who exist primarily to validate her life choices. The bracelet, $47,000, a push present Preston gave her at 5 months pregnant, sparkles as she angles her wrist perfectly for the camera. "You're literally living every girl's dream," Madison coos, sipping a Bellini that costs more than some people's car payments. Brielle smiles, but there's something tight around her eyes. She's been checking her phone compulsively all morning. Preston's been distant lately, distracted. When she asks about business, he snaps. When she suggests dinner plans, he says he's tired. "Did you see Zendaya's LinkedIn update?" Chelsea asks, scrolling on her phone. Brielle's smile freezes. "Who?" "Preston's ex-wife. She just changed her company name to Rutherford Development Group. Weird, right? Why would she rebrand 6 months after the divorce?" The table goes quiet. They all know the cardinal rule. Don't mention the ex-wife. But Brielle's curiosity wins. "Let me see." The profile is sparse. Professional photo, Zendaya looking polished but understated. The bio is different though. No longer senior development consultant. Now it reads, founder and CEO, Rutherford Development Group, managing principal, Rutherford Enterprises. Rutherford Enterprises. Something about that name tugs at Brielle's memory. She Googles it under the table. The results make her stomach drop. Rutherford Enterprises, private conglomerate, estimated value $6.2 billion, holdings in shipping, logistics, infrastructure, commercial real estate across 34 countries. There's a recent news article. Reclusive billionaire Julian Rutherford dies at 78, leaves fortune to previously unknown daughter. Brielle's hands start shaking. She clicks the article, scans frantically, finds the line that makes the world tilt. Sources confirm the sole heir is Zendaya Amara Carter, 32, a real estate development executive based in New York. DNA testing confirmed paternity prior to Rutherford's death. Ms. Carter, who was apparently unaware of her biological connection to the late billionaire, now controls one of the world's largest private fortunes. The date on the article, 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Brielle's face goes white. The bracelet suddenly feels like a toy. The Cipriani lunch like a child's tea party. The mansion, the lifestyle, Preston himself, all of it shrinks in perspective. Because the woman Preston discarded, the obstacle he'd overcome to be with Brielle, the wife he'd painted as cold and career-obsessed and fundamentally less than, that woman was now worth more than Preston would earn in 50 lifetimes. "Brie, you okay?" Madison's voice sounds distant. Brielle can't breathe. She's calculating. Preston's entire net worth, the properties, the investments, everything is maybe $200 million. Impressive to normal people. Barely a rounding error compared to $6.2 billion. And Zendaya had that money before Preston even started house hunting for their mansion. Before Brielle's viral pregnancy announcement. Before the Hamptons engagement party that made page 6. Zendaya had been a billionaire the entire time, and she'd said nothing. Just signed the divorce papers, took the $15 million settlement Preston offered like it was pocket change, walked away quietly while everyone assumed she was the loser in this story. "I need to go," Brielle says, grabbing her bag. "But we haven't even—" "I need to go." She's out the door before they can finish the sentence, phone pressed to her ear, calling Preston for the 4th time this morning. He doesn't answer. Because 200 miles away, Preston is in a meeting with his accountant and his lawyer, staring at documents that explain why 3 of his biggest investors just pulled out. The investors who Zendaya had originally connected him with. The ones who, apparently, are now much more interested in working with a Rutherford than a man who'd publicly humiliated one. Preston's hands are shaking as he reads the email from his biggest commercial lender. "In light of recent developments in market repositioning, we'll be calling your loan early. Full payment due in 90 days. Non-negotiable. 90 days to find $43 million. Money he doesn't have liquid. Money he can't raise fast enough. His phone buzzes. Brielle, ninth call today. He declines it. Because Preston is beginning to understand something terrifying. He didn't divorce his wife. He divorced his entire safety net, and now the ground is crumbling beneath him. If you love stories about underestimated women, karma delivered with precision, and watching people realize they fumbled something irreplaceable, this one's for you. Hit subscribe because crafting these detailed stories takes serious time and research. Let's get into it. 6 months earlier, Zendaya Carter had been a different woman. Not in capability, she'd always been brilliant, but in confidence, in the belief that her worth was tied to someone else's validation. She'd built her career methodically, Detroit public schools to Wharton on full scholarship, graduating top 5% while working part-time to send money home to her mother. Wall Street recruited her hard, but Zendaya chose real estate development instead. Something tangible. Buildings that would outlast market crashes and economic cycles. By 30, she was closing 8-figure deals, luxury condos in Tribeca, mixed-use developments in Brooklyn, commercial properties that transform neighborhoods. That's where Preston found her. He was at an industry conference, heir to a respectable Midwest real estate portfolio, good-looking in that country club way, charming when he wanted to be. His family had money, $50 million, maybe $80 million if you counted illiquid assets. Enough to be comfortable, not enough to be immune to ambition. Preston saw Zendaya across a ballroom and saw opportunity. She was elegant, accomplished, connected to people he needed access to. She was also black, which made her an interesting trophy for a man who considered himself progressive for dating outside his race. He pursued her aggressively, flowers to her office, surprise reservations at restaurants with 6-month waiting lists, a weekend trip to Napa, just because. Zendaya, who'd spent her 20s grinding, who'd sacrificed social life for career success, who'd watched friends get married while she reviewed contracts on Friday nights, she was lonely enough to believe it was real. They married 2 years later. Hampton's wedding, 300 guests. Her mother cried through the ceremony, though Zendaya could never tell if they were happy tears or worried ones. For the first year, it was good. They were a team. Zendaya's analytical mind and Preston's family connections made them formidable. She'd identify undervalued properties. He'd leverage his network to close deals faster. Their combined portfolio grew from respectable to impressive. $200 million became their target, then $300 million. Preston talked about building a dynasty, but somewhere around year 2, the dynamics shifted. Preston started taking credit for deals Zendaya had structured. At dinner parties, he'd tell the story of their biggest acquisition, editing her out of the narrative entirely. "I saw the opportunity," he'd say, "took a risk everyone else was too scared to take." Zendaya would sit there, smile frozen, saying nothing. Because she'd been raised to be gracious, to not embarrass your husband in public, to believe that a strong woman builds her man up, not tears him down. She ignored the late nights he claimed were investor meetings, ignored the perfume that wasn't hers lingering on his suits, ignored the way he'd started introducing her as my wife instead of my partner. The thing about being brilliant is that you see patterns others miss. Zendaya saw the pattern. She just chose to believe she was wrong. Until the day she came home early from a site inspection and found Preston in their bedroom with Brielle. The girl, and she was a girl, only 27, with Instagram-perfect features and the kind of beauty that required a team, was wearing Zendaya's robe. Preston didn't even look ashamed, just inconvenienced. "This isn't what you think," he'd started. "It's exactly what I think. Brielle and I, we have something real. She's pregnant, Zen. I'm going to be a father." The words landed like physical blows. Pregnant. They'd been trying for a baby for 8 months. Zendaya had appointments with fertility specialists, had started taking hormones that made her emotional and exhausted, had begun imagining the family they'd build together. And while she was doing that, Preston was building a different family with someone else. "I want a divorce," Zendaya said, voice eerily calm. "I'll make it easy," Preston said, like he was doing her a favor. 15 million, the penthouse. You keep your reputation, I keep mine. We both move on like adults." Zendaya signed the papers 2 weeks later. Everyone assumed she'd lost. They had no idea she'd been set free. Preston and Brielle didn't just move on, they performed their happiness like a Broadway production. The engagement happened 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. A sunset proposal on a yacht in St. Bart's, professionally photographed, released to People magazine the same day. Brielle's Instagram post got 4.2 million likes. "When you know, you know. Forever with my soulmate starts now. #blessed. #new beginnings. #chose me." The caption had undertones only people close to the situation would catch. "Chose me" implied someone else hadn't been chosen. The implication was clear. Zendaya had been the warm-up act. Brielle was the main event. The wedding came fast. 3 months pregnant, Brielle wore Vera Wang, a custom gown that cost $85,000 and required 17 fittings. The ceremony was at a vineyard in Tuscany. Destination wedding. 150 guests. Brielle's influencer friends documented everything. Preston looked happy in the photos. Genuinely happy, like he'd finally gotten what he deserved. What he'd actually gotten was a wife who saw him as content, not a partner. Brielle's entire life was performance. The pregnancy announcement, professional maternity shoot, matching outfits, gender reveal party with a helicopter dropping pink powder over their new mansion. Every milestone was monetized. Sponsored posts for prenatal vitamins, designer baby furniture, luxury strollers that cost more than used cars. Her follower count exploded. 900,000 became 1.4 million. Brands that had ignored her when she was just another influencer suddenly wanted partnerships. Because now she wasn't just beautiful, she was rich adjacent. Preston adjacent. Mrs. Carter, the woman who'd won. Preston enabled all of it because Brielle made him feel like the man Zendaya never had. She didn't question his decisions, didn't offer alternative strategies in meetings, didn't make him feel intellectually insufficient by being smarter than him. She just looked beautiful and told him he was brilliant and spent his money in ways that signaled success. The mansion was the crown jewel. $28 million in the Hollywood Hills, infinity pool, home theater, nursery that was featured in Architectural Digest before the baby was even born. Brielle filled it with things, designer furniture, art she didn't understand but had been told was valuable, a staff of 5 to maintain a lifestyle that required constant upkeep. Preston paid for all of it, and at first it felt good, felt like winning. He divorced the serious wife who'd made him feel small and married the fun one who made him feel like a king. But slowly, so slowly he didn't notice at first, the bills started adding up in ways that stressed even his considerable resources. The mortgage on the mansion. Brielle's spending, $40,000 monthly on average. The staff, the cars, the jewelry, the constant pressure to maintain an image that required ever-increasing investment. His accountant started leaving voicemails Preston ignored. His lawyer sent emails about cash flow concerns that Preston dismissed as overcautious. Because Preston had always believed money was infinite when you had the right name and the right connections. What he didn't realize, most of those connections had come through Zendaya, the investors she'd introduced him to, the partners she'd vetted, the deals she'd structured that made him look competent. Without her quietly managing the foundation, Preston's empire was starting to crack. Small cracks, hairline fractures, nothing catastrophic yet. But Brielle noticed. She noticed when Preston started saying, maybe next month, to purchases that used to be automatic. Noticed when he snapped at her about the American Express bill. Noticed when he stopped talking about the next big acquisition. She'd been Googling Zendaya obsessively since the divorce, looking for signs the ex-wife was suffering, looking for confirmation that she, Brielle, had won. Instead, she found silence. Zendaya's social media had gone dark. Her LinkedIn was sparse. No public appearances, no interviews, nothing that suggested wealth or success or even basic survival. Brielle had taken that as victory. The ex-wife had faded into irrelevance while Brielle ascended. Until that lunch at Cipriani, until that Google search, until the moment Brielle discovered that silence hadn't been defeat, it had been strategy. If you discovered your ex, who you thought had downgraded after leaving you, was actually secretly a billionaire the entire time, what would your first thought be? What nobody saw was what Zendaya did in the 6 months after signing those divorce papers. She didn't break down, didn't spiral, didn't post cryptic quotes about betrayal on Instagram. She simply disappeared. Moved out of the shared penthouse into a smaller but beautiful Tribeca loft. Minimalist. Hers. A space untouched by Preston's preferences or Brielle's ghost. She hired a therapist, Dr. Michelle Lawrence, a Black woman who specialized in high-achieving professionals processing identity crises. You spent 5 years building someone else's empire, Dr. Lawrence said during their third session. What do you want to build for yourself? Zendaya had sketched plans for her own development firm for years, projects she dreamed about but postponed because Preston's deals took priority. Mixed income housing that actually worked. Community-centered developments that didn't displace the people who'd lived there for generations. Buildings that were profitable but ethical. She started drafting business plans, quietly reaching out to old contacts, not asking for anything, just coffee, reconnection, feeling out the landscape. The inheritance letter arrived on a Tuesday. Zendaya had come home from a coffee meeting with a former Wharton classmate who now ran an architecture firm. She was tired but hopeful, feeling like maybe she could rebuild something real. The attorney was waiting in her building lobby, distinguished, British accent, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Miss Carter? I'm Jeffrey Whitmore, representing the estate of Julian Rutherford. That name, the one her mother had mentioned exactly twice, both times after too much wine and always with pain in her eyes. What followed was 2 hours of information that rewrote Zendaya's understanding of her own existence. Julian Rutherford, shipping magnate, logistics genius, infrastructure developer across 4 continents, had died 3 months earlier, childless by all public accounts. His will told a different story. He knew about you, Jeffrey explained gently, had known since before you were born. Your mother, she was young. He was married. It was complicated. He abandoned her. Zendaya's voice was flat. He did, but he never stopped following your life. Scholarships you thought were merit-based? Many were quietly funded by trusts he'd established. Contracts that came through at crucial moments, some were encouraged by his network. He was manipulating my life? He was ensuring you had opportunities, without interference. He wanted you to build yourself. Jeffrey slid documents across the coffee table. And you did. He was extraordinarily proud. $6.2 billion. Properties in Manhattan, London, Singapore, Dubai. Controlling interests in 3 publicly traded companies. A shipping fleet. Infrastructure projects in developing nations. Investment portfolios managed by the best firms in the world. All of it now hers. Why? Zendaya whispered. Jeffrey handed her the letter. The one Julian had written in shaky handwriting 3 months before his death. The one that explained he couldn't give her a father, but he could give her tools. Zendaya read it twice, cried quietly, then wiped her face and asked the question that mattered. What do I need to do to take control? Jeffrey smiled. That's exactly what he hoped you'd ask. Preston first noticed something was wrong when Richard Callahan didn't return his calls. Callahan was one of Preston's biggest investors, $30 million across 3 projects, reliable capital, steady partnership for 4 years. They'd had drinks scheduled for Thursday. Then Callahan's assistant called to reschedule. Then reschedule again. Then finally, a brief email. Richard is reallocating his portfolio priorities. He'll be in touch when relevant opportunities arise. Portfolio reallocation. The professional way of saying, I'm done with you. Preston didn't panic immediately. One investor pulling back wasn't catastrophic. Then 2 more did the same thing within a week. Different reasons, same outcome. His commercial loan officer at Deutsche Bank requested a meeting. Just routine review, she said. Nothing to worry about. Except there was something in her voice, a distance that hadn't been there before. The meeting was tense, professional but cold. She asked questions about cash flow, about the mansion purchase, about monthly burn rate. Your debt-to-income ratio has shifted significantly, she said, sliding a document across the table. We're concerned about over-leveraging. I've always carried debt. That's how real estate works. Your previous loans were structured with Zendaya Carter as co-signer or co-investor. Her analysis and projections provided confidence. Now, she paused, now you're a single point of risk. The words landed like a slap. Preston left that meeting furious, at Zendaya for leaving, at the bank for doubting him, at the universe for making everything harder than it needed to be. He went home to the mansion, the $28 million monument to his success, and found Brielle in the nursery, staging a photo shoot for a sponsored post. She was 6 months pregnant now, glowing and exhausted in equal measure, lying on a designer chair that cost $8,000, holding bottles of prenatal vitamins she'd never actually taken. How'd it go? She asked absently, adjusting her angle for the camera. Fine. You said the bank thing was just routine. It was, but his voice was tight. Brielle looked up, really looked at him, and saw stress she hadn't noticed before. Preston, is money okay? Money's fine. Why would you ask that? Because you've been weird about bills lately, and you didn't want to do the Malibu weekend I planned. The Malibu weekend cost $40,000 for 3 days. So, we've spent that before. That was before. He stopped himself. It's fine. Money's fine. I just need to close the Atlanta deal and everything rebalances. The Atlanta deal. A mixed-use development he'd been structuring for 8 months. $120 million project. His biggest solo deal since the divorce. The deal that was starting to fall apart because the primary investor, someone Zendaya had originally introduced him to, was suddenly reassessing timeline and fit. Preston didn't tell Brielle that part. He also didn't tell her that 3 of his most reliable contractors had suddenly raised their rates by 20%, or that 2 properties he'd planned to flip were sitting unsold despite price reductions, or that his lawyer had sent increasingly urgent emails about legal fee arrears. What he told himself was that this was temporary, a rough patch, normal market fluctuation. He'd weathered challenges before. Except before, he'd had Zendaya quietly managing the foundation while he managed the flash. Now he had Brielle, who was brilliant at Instagram but had never read a P&L statement in her life. That night, unable to sleep, Preston did what he'd been avoiding for months. He Googled his ex-wife. The search results had changed. There were new articles, recent ones, about Rutherford Enterprises, about an unnamed heir taking control of a massive fortune, about strategic shifts in global infrastructure investment. Then he found the profile update on LinkedIn. Zendaya Carter, founder and CEO, Rutherford Development Group, managing principal, Rutherford Enterprises. Rutherford. He knew that name. Everyone in real estate did. Julian Rutherford had been a legend, the billionaire who'd built an empire so quietly most people didn't know he existed until after he was dead. Preston read the article about his death, about the sole heir, about the daughter no one knew existed. His hands started shaking. He did the math, checked the dates. cross-referenced timelines. Zendaya had inherited this fortune 4 months ago. 4 months, which meant she'd been a billionaire when she signed divorce papers asking for $15 million. She'd been one of the richest women in America when Preston was buying Brielle that mansion. She'd had the power to destroy him the entire time and had simply walked away. Until now. Preston read deeper, found mentions of Rutherford Enterprises reallocating capital towards strategic partnerships with visionary developers. Found a quote from an unnamed source. Miss Carter is being selective about who she works with. Integrity matters more than scale. Integrity. The word felt like an indictment. Preston closed his laptop and sat in the dark, understanding with perfect clarity that he'd made the worst mistake of his life, and it was far too late to fix it. Zendaya's first board meeting as majority owner of Rutherford Enterprises happened in a conference room 73 floors above Manhattan. 12 executives who'd run this empire for decades sat around a table, skeptical and barely hiding it. She was 32, untested in global logistics, an outsider being handed control because of biology, not merit. Jeffrey Whitmore made introductions. Zendaya sat at the head of the table, spine straight, wearing a Tom Ford suit that cost more than she used to make in a month, and let them finish their polite doubts. Then she opened her laptop. I've spent 3 months analyzing every division. Shipping's operating margins are down 8% year over year, mostly due to inefficient route planning that could be optimized with better data analytics. Infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia are over budget because local partnerships aren't being vetted properly, and the commercial real estate holdings in North America are underperforming because we're not adapting to mixed-use demand. The room went quiet. I'm not here to dismantle what my father built, Zendaya continued. I'm here to evolve it. We're sitting on $6.2 billion that should be growing at 12% annually and is currently growing at 7%. That's $310 million in lost opportunity every year. She spent the next hour presenting a restructuring plan so detailed, so thoroughly researched, that the skepticism slowly transformed into attention. By the end, the CFO, a man who'd worked with Julian for 20 years, was nodding. This is comprehensive. I know how to build things, Zendaya said simply. My father gave me the resources. I'm giving you the strategy. The vote to approve her plan was unanimous. Afterward, Jeffrey found her looking out at the city from the executive floor. You surprised them. I surprised myself. Zendaya turned. I've been thinking about something. The commercial real estate portfolio. We own properties in 12 cities. I want to start a development initiative. Mixed income housing. Community partnerships. Profitable but ethical. That's ambitious. It's necessary, and I want to do it in New York first. I've already identified 3 properties that could be reimagined. She pulled up a document on her tablet, including one Preston was trying to acquire. Jeffrey's eyebrows rose. The Atlantic Yards project? He's been structuring that deal for months, needs $80 million in funding to close. His primary investor is someone my father worked with for years. And I called that investor yesterday, offered him something better. Jeffrey smiled slowly. You're going to take the deal? I'm going to build it properly. Preston's plan was luxury condos that would price out everyone who actually lives in that neighborhood. I'm proposing mixed income units, green space, community facilities. Better project, better ROI, better for the city, and significantly undermines your ex-husband's credibility. That's a side benefit. Zendaya's voice was ice. He sold me as the obstacle to his success. Time to show everyone who the actual obstacle was. The next day, Preston got the call from his Atlanta investor. We're pulling out of the Atlantic Yards project. Preston's voice was steady, but his hands weren't. Why? We're 60 days from closing. Rutherford Enterprises approached us with an alternative proposal. Better terms, better vision, and honestly, Preston, Better developer. No hard feelings. It's just business. The line went dead. Preston sat in his home office, the mansion suddenly feeling less like achievement and more like liability, and understood exactly what was happening. Zendaya wasn't just moving on with her life, she was systematically dismantling his. Not loudly, not publicly, just quietly redirecting the capital, the partnerships, the opportunities that had made him successful. And she could do it because she had something he never would. Resources so vast that his entire net worth was a rounding error in her portfolio. He called his lawyer. "We need to talk about the divorce settlement. There might be grounds to renegotiate given changed circumstances." His lawyer was quiet for a long moment. "Preston, she signed an ironclad agreement. You offered $15 million. She accepted. There's no legal basis for renegotiation just because she inherited money after the fact. There has to be something." "There isn't. And honestly, if I were you, I'd be grateful she's being civil about this. She could make your life much harder if she wanted to." Preston hung up and finally understood what terror felt like. Because Zendaya wasn't being civil. She was being strategic, and the worst was still coming. Was Zendaya justified in using her resources to outmaneuver Preston's deals? Or should she have just moved on completely? Where's the line? The article dropped on a Monday morning. Forbes ran it as their cover story. "The Invisible Heiress: How Zendaya Carter Became One of America's Richest Women, and No One Noticed." The piece was thorough, detailed, devastating in its implications. It covered Julian Rutherford's secret daughter, the DNA testing that had confirmed paternity 5 years before his death, the $6.2 billion inheritance, the quiet way Zendaya had taken control of a global empire while her ex-husband flaunted his much smaller fortune with his new wife. There were photos. Zendaya at a Rutherford Enterprises board meeting. Zendaya touring a development site in Brooklyn. Zendaya looking powerful, composed, untouchable. The article quoted industry insiders. Preston Carter built his reputation partly on his marriage to Zendaya. Her analysis, her connections, she was the infrastructure. Without her, his portfolio has struggled. Meanwhile, she's operating at a completely different level. It's not even comparable. Another quote, this one anonymous. Brielle Hayes thought she won by marrying Preston, but she actually downgraded, dramatically. The piece went viral within hours. Business Insider picked it up, then Bloomberg. Then gossip sites that normally covered celebrities started running angles about the mistress who chose wrong. Brielle's phone exploded with notifications, DMs from followers. "Wait, you left a billionaire for a millionaire?" Comments on her Instagram. "Imagine thinking you upgraded and actually downgrading by $6 billion. Think pieces on Twitter. Brielle Hayes is the cautionary tale about confusing flash for substance. She tried calling Preston. He didn't answer. Was probably dealing with his own nightmare. Investors seeing the Forbes article and realizing exactly how out of his league he was compared to his ex-wife. Brielle locked herself in the nursery and did something she'd been avoiding for months. She read everything about Zendaya. Not the divorce narrative, the real story. Wharton scholarship student, top of her class, built a career in one of the most competitive industries in the world, closed deals that Preston had taken credit for, quietly been the foundation of his success. And Brielle had convinced herself that she, a woman whose career was posting bikini photos, had been the upgrade. The delusion was staggering. That evening, Preston finally came home. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. "Did you see?" Brielle started. Everyone saw. "What are we going to do?" "We?" Preston's voice was sharp. "What are we going to do?" "I'm your wife, your pregnant wife. You're the reason I'm in this position." He was shouting now, control finally shattering. "You wanted the mansion, the cars, the lifestyle. You wanted me to divorce Zendaya so you could play queen. And now look where we are." "I didn't know she was..." "Neither did I. But at least I built something real before this. You're just a pretty face with a phone, and now everyone knows that I traded a billionaire genius for an Instagram model." The words hit like physical blows. Brielle's hands went to her stomach, protective. "I'm carrying your child." Preston's face softened slightly, guilt flickering through rage. "I know. I'm sorry, it's just... everything's falling apart." "How bad is it?" "Bad. The bank called my loans. I have 90 days to pay $43 million, or they start foreclosing. I can't raise that kind of capital fast enough. My investors are bailing. Contractors are demanding payment up front. And every deal I try to structure, Zendaya's gotten there first with better terms." "Can't you just talk to her?" Preston laughed bitterly. "And say what? Sorry I publicly humiliated you by cheating with a woman half your substance. Can we be friends now?" She's not interested in reconciliation, Brielle. She's interested in showing the world what I actually am without her. Which is? He didn't answer, because they both knew. Without Zendaya, Preston was just another mediocre man who'd been propped up by someone exceptional. And now that prop was gone, leaving him to collapse in real time, while the world watched. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Wednesday. Preston opened it at the kitchen island of the $28 million mansion, while Brielle prepared for a prenatal appointment. His hands shook, reading the legal language that essentially said, "You have 30 days to vacate." 30 days. He'd failed to make the loan payment, failed to restructure the debt, failed to find investors willing to bail him out. The bank was taking the house. "Preston?" Brielle's voice came from the hallway. "We need to leave in 10 minutes. He couldn't tell her. Not yet. Not while she was 7 months pregnant and already stressed about the Forbes article, about the social media comments, about the way her friends had started treating her differently. He folded the notice and shoved it in his desk drawer. At the appointment, the doctor said everything looked perfect. Healthy baby, healthy mother. They were having a girl. Brielle cried with joy. Preston managed to smile. All he could think about was how he'd afford childcare when they were living in, where? An apartment? His parents' house? He didn't even know anymore. That night, his lawyer called. "Preston, we need to discuss bankruptcy." "Absolutely not. You're $67 million in debt with assets worth maybe $40 million. The math doesn't work." "I'll figure something out." "There's nothing to figure out. File Chapter 11, restructure, start over. It's not ideal, but it's survivable." "My name will be destroyed." "Your name is already destroyed. Forbes did that. Now it's about minimizing damage." Preston hung up and poured himself scotch. The $400 bottle he'd been saving for celebrating the Atlanta deal. The deal Zendaya had taken from him. He drank alone in his home office, looking out at the infinity pool that would belong to someone else in 30 days, and finally let himself feel the full weight of his choices. He'd left Zendaya because she made him feel small, because her competence highlighted his mediocrity, because Brielle had seemed easier, less challenging, less complicated, but easy wasn't the same as valuable. And now he understood. Zendaya hadn't made him small. She'd been holding him up, and he'd mistaken support for suffocation. Meanwhile, across the city, Zendaya sat in a different kind of meeting. The mayor's office had requested her presence. They were discussing affordable housing initiatives, green building standards, community development partnerships. "Ms. Carter, your proposal for the Brooklyn sites is exactly what this city needs," the deputy mayor said. "Mixed income housing that actually works. We'd like to fast-track permits." "I appreciate that. I also want to establish a grant program for first-time homebuyers in those developments. Help families who've been priced out of their own neighborhoods." "That's generous. It's strategic. Sustainable communities require economic diversity. I'm building for the long term." After the meeting, Zendaya had coffee with her former Wharton classmate, the architect who was designing her Brooklyn project. "I saw the Forbes article," Marcus said. "Everyone did. How's it feel having the world know you're a billionaire? Strange, validating, complicated. And Preston? Zendaya stirred her coffee. Preston's learning what happens when you mistake support for weakness. You're destroying him. I'm not destroying him. I'm just not holding him up anymore. Turns out he can't stand on his own. Marcus studied her. Do you regret the marriage? I regret the time, the energy, the belief that love meant making myself smaller. She looked up. But I don't regret leaving. Best decision I ever made. Even though it hurt? Preston's bankruptcy filing made page 6 before it was even processed by the court. Millionaire real estate developer files Chapter 11 after massive debt crisis, months after divorcing billionaire wife. The comments section was merciless. He fumbled a billionaire for an influencer. That's generational stupidity. Imagine your ex being worth 31 times more than you, and you thought you upgraded. This is what happens when you confuse Instagram likes for actual value. Brielle read every comment, couldn't stop herself even though each one felt like a knife. Her own followers had turned on her, lost 200,000 in a week. Brands canceled partnerships. The few that remained wanted to renegotiate terms at 60% lower rates. She was 7 months pregnant, her husband was bankrupt, and they were losing the mansion in 3 weeks. Her mother called. Move back to Connecticut, we have room. The thought of going back to her childhood bedroom, pregnant, broke, humiliated, made Brielle want to disappear. We'll figure something out, she told her mother. But there was nothing to figure out. Preston's parents offered them the guest house on their property in Vermont. Charity, not hospitality. The kind of help that came with judgment and disappointed sighs. They moved in on a Saturday. Brielle cried the entire 4-hour drive. The guest house was nice. 2 bedrooms, small kitchen, views of the mountains. It was also a prison. No staff, no infinity pool, no life that looked good on Instagram. Brielle stopped posting, went silent for weeks. Preston got a job at a commercial real estate firm. Not as a partner, as an associate, salary plus commission. Maybe $150,000 a year if he hustled. After running his own deals, after being his own boss, after years of 7-figure paydays, it was humiliating. His new boss was younger than him, gave him remedial assignments, treated him like the cautionary tale he'd become. The baby was born in early December, a girl. They named her Grace. She was beautiful, perfect, and Brielle looked at her daughter and felt crushing guilt. This child would grow up knowing her father had been wealthy once, that her mother had been the reason he'd lost everything, that they'd chosen wrong and ruined 3 lives in the process. Preston held Grace in the hospital and felt the same guilt. This wasn't the life he'd imagined for his daughter. Not the Vermont guest house or the modest salary or the parents who'd become a cautionary tale. He thought about Zendaya, about the child they could have had, about the life they could have built if he'd been secure enough to stand beside a woman more successful than him. But it was too late for alternative histories. Grace was here. Brielle was his wife. This was his reality, and he'd earned every uncomfortable inch of it. 1 year after the divorce, Zendaya stood on stage at the Women in Business Summit in Los Angeles. 2,000 attendees, live streamed to 400,000 more. She'd been invited to give the keynote about building generational wealth and using power ethically. She wore red, bold, unapologetic, and her presence commanded the room before she spoke a single word. A year ago, I signed divorce papers believing I'd failed, she began. I'd spent 5 years building someone else's empire at the expense of my own. I'd made myself smaller to make someone else comfortable. And when he left, I thought that proved I wasn't enough. The room was silent, listening. Then I inherited $6.2 billion from a father I never knew. And suddenly everyone wanted to know how it felt to be a billionaire. She paused. But here's the truth. The money didn't change me. It just gave me resources that matched what I'd always been capable of. The intelligence, the strategy, the vision. I had that before. I just hadn't believed it was enough without someone else validating it. She talked about the developments she was building, the affordable housing initiatives, the community partnerships that prioritize people over profit margins. Wealth isn't about how much you have, it's about what you build with it. And I'm building something that will outlast me, something that helps people who look like me, who came from where I came from, who've been told they're not enough. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Afterward, she did press interviews. Forbes, Bloomberg, Oprah's network. Everyone wanted the revenge story. The ex-husband who'd fumbled, the mistress who'd panicked. Zendaya gave them something better. I don't think about Preston anymore. Not with anger, not with satisfaction. He's just not relevant to my life. And that's the real freedom. Not destroying him, not proving anything, just building something so significant that his entire existence becomes a footnote I don't need to revisit. The quote went viral. Hashtag not relevant to my life trended for 2 days. Young women, especially Black women, started using it as a mantra. The idea that the best revenge wasn't destruction, but irrelevance. Zendaya's foundation launched that spring, $500 million dedicated to supporting women entrepreneurs, particularly women of color building in industries that historically excluded them. She partnered with universities, funded research, created accelerator programs, and quietly, without publicity, she sent an anonymous donation to a scholarship fund at the school in Vermont where Grace, Preston's daughter, would eventually attend. Not for Preston, not even for Brielle, for the child who deserved better than to suffer for her parents' choices. Because that was the difference between Zendaya and the people who'd underestimated her. She'd learned that power wasn't about punishment, it was about building something so meaningful that revenge became irrelevant. If you had Zendaya's resources and position, would you have helped your ex's child despite everything? Where do you draw the line between justice and grace? The invitation arrived at Preston's small rental apartment in Burlington. Cream cardstock, embossed lettering, elegant. You are cordially invited to the grand opening of the Rutherford Community Center. It was in Brooklyn, the development Zendaya had built on the site Preston had tried to acquire. He almost threw it away. Then he saw the handwritten note. Preston, you don't owe me anything, not explanations, not apologies, but I wanted you to see what's possible when we build for communities instead of portfolios. Bring your family if you'd like. Z. Brielle found him staring at it. Are you going? I don't know. I think you should. We should. Grace was 3 now, beautiful, bright, blissfully unaware of the complicated history that had shaped her existence. They drove down from Vermont on a Saturday. The community center was stunning, modern architecture that honored the neighborhood's history, green space, facilities for arts education, job training, childcare. Hundreds of people attended. Locals who'd been involved in the planning, city officials, press, and Zendaya, standing at the center of it all, radiant in her power, greeting everyone with genuine warmth. She saw Preston across the courtyard. Their eyes met for the first time in 3 years. She walked over. Brielle stiffened, but Zendaya's expression held no malice. Preston, thank you for coming. It's impressive, what you've built here. It's what we should have been building all along. She looked at Grace, who was playing near a fountain. She's beautiful. Thank you. Awkward silence. Then Zendaya said something that would stay with Preston forever. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, because I deserve peace. She walked away before he could respond, back to the community she'd built, the legacy she was creating, the life that had nothing to do with him anymore. Preston stood there holding his daughter's hand and finally understood. Zendaya hadn't destroyed him. She'd simply become so extraordinary that his betrayal had become irrelevant. And that, more than any revenge, more than any public humiliation, was the most devastating consequence of all. Being forgotten by someone you'd once defined yourself against. Being irrelevant to a story that had moved so far beyond you that you were barely a prologue. Brielle took his hand. They watched Zendaya cut the ribbon, watched the community celebrate, watched the life Preston could have been part of if he'd been brave enough to stand beside someone greater than himself. Then they drove back to Vermont, back to their small life, back to the reality they'd chosen. And Zendaya? She went home to her penthouse, to the empire she'd built, to the legacy that would outlast everyone who'd ever doubted her. Unbothered, unbroken, unstoppable. Here's what Zendaya's story teaches us. Being underestimated is a gift. Not because it doesn't hurt, it does, but because it shows you exactly what you're capable of when no one's watching, when no one believes, when the only person you have to prove anything to is yourself. Preston saw Zendaya as support staff for his ambition. Brielle saw her as an obstacle to overcome. The world saw her as the wife who got traded in for a newer model. They were all wrong. Zendaya wasn't any of those things. She was a force waiting for the right moment to show the world what she'd always been. Exceptional. The inheritance didn't make her powerful. It just gave her resources that matched the power she'd always possessed. And the revenge? It wasn't revenge. It was simply Zendaya building something so significant that Preston's betrayal became a footnote in a much larger story. That's the lesson. The best response to being underestimated isn't destruction, it's construction. Building something so extraordinary that the people who doubted you become irrelevant to your narrative. Preston lost a billionaire wife and gained a cautionary tale status. Brielle lost her influencer career and gained the reputation of being the woman who chose wrong. They'll spend the rest of their lives knowing they fumbled someone irreplaceable. And Zendaya? She'll spend hers building communities, funding dreams, creating opportunities for people who remind her of who she used to be. She forgave them, not because they deserved it, because she deserved peace. That's power, not the money, not the properties, the ability to move so far beyond betrayal that you genuinely don't need the people who hurt you to suffer. You just need them to be irrelevant. Preston and Brielle got exactly what they deserved. Each other, modest lives, and the lifelong knowledge that they traded significance for comfort. And Zendaya got exactly what she'd always deserved, the world recognizing what she'd always been. Extraordinary. If this story resonated, if you believe in building yourself so completely that revenge becomes unnecessary, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment about a time you were underestimated and proved everyone wrong. And smash that like button if you think Zendaya handled this with the perfect balance of grace and power. See you in the next one. Until then, remember, never shrink yourself to make mediocre people comfortable. Build yourself so big they become irrelevant.